Ever wondered what crazy promises people made in the Middle Ages? Could you imagine swearing never to change your underwear until Jerusalem was conquered? Number 8. The Silent Knight's Pledge. Have you ever tried not speaking for a whole day? Imagine going silent for years. In 1415, a French knight named Michel de Montaigne, not the famous writer, but a lesser-known warrior, made one of the strangest vows recorded in medieval history. After failing to protect his lord during the Battle of Agincourt, Michel pledged a vow of complete silence until he had redeemed himself through acts of valor. The silence wasn't just about not chatting casually. Michel would not utter a single word, grunt or sound. He carried a small wooden tablet and piece of chalk to communicate when absolutely necessary. According to chronicles kept by a monastery where he occasionally sought shelter, Michel maintained this vow for an astonishing 7 years. The most fascinating part, Michel developed an elaborate system of gestures so complex that his squire could understand detailed battle plans through hand movements alone. Other knights initially mocked the Silent Knight, as he became known, but stories suggest that his eerie silence during combat unnerved opponents who were used to the shouting and noise of medieval warfare. Michel's vow ended when he saved the life of a prominent duke during a skirmish with bandits. The first words he spoke after 7 years of silence were reportedly, "My honor is restored," though his voice had become so raspy and unused that few could understand him at first. Local lore claims Michel's unusual vow inspired several young knights to take similar pledges, though none maintained their silence for more than a few months. The practice became known in parts of France as Michel's penance, and was considered one of the most difficult personal vows a knight could undertake. Number 7. The Unwashed Crusader. Would you skip bathing for years? Some medieval crusaders took extreme hygiene vows. In 1188, a German nobleman named Konrad von Wettin made a vow that would have his companions keeping their distance. After hearing Pope Gregory VIII's call for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem, Konrad swore he would neither bathe nor change his clothes until the holy city was back in Christian hands. This wasn't just a casual promise. Konrad had official witnesses present and had the vow documented by a church scribe. He wore the same woolen tunic, leather jerkin, and undergarments day after day, month after month, year after year. He allowed himself only to rinse his hands before meals and prayer, as required by custom, but no other part of his body would touch water. According to accounts from his long-suffering traveling companions, within months, Konrad had developed a smell so potent that other crusaders insisted he camp downwind from the main army. One chronicler noted that even the most devout men found it difficult to stand in prayer beside the unwashed one, whose stench seemed a greater penance than the journey itself. The most incredible part, Konrad maintained this vow for 9 years. When Richard the Lionheart's treaty with Saladin in 1192 allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, but left the city under Muslim control, Konrad considered his vow unfulfilled. He continued his unwashed state, even after returning to his German estate. Family documents suggest his wife initially moved to a separate wing of their castle, but eventually developed a tolerance for his condition. Local peasants reported that you could smell the noble approaching from nearly half a mile away on a warm day. Konrad finally broke his vow in 1197. Not because Jerusalem was recaptured, it wasn't, but at the direct order of his bishop, who declared that the vow had become a penance to all who encounter him, rather than to himself alone. The first bath he took reportedly required 7 tubs of water, and servants had to burn his clothing in a field far from human habitation. Number 6. The One-Footed Pilgrim. Have you ever hopped on one foot? Imagine traveling hundreds of miles that way. In 1267, an English merchant named Thomas Becket, no relation to the famous saint, made a vow that had people staring in disbelief from London to Canterbury. After recovering from a severe leg injury that doctors had wanted to amputate, Thomas swore gratitude to God by pledging to complete a pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral, standing only on the leg that had been saved. This meant hopping on his right foot for approximately 60 miles. Thomas took this vow seriously, crafting a special wooden crutch to help balance, but never allowing his left foot to touch the ground. He wore a distinctive red sock on his traveling foot and kept the other bare as a reminder of his pledge. Thomas didn't attempt the journey in one go. Records from various inns and monasteries along the pilgrimage route show he completed the journey over 40 days, hopping between 1 to 2 miles per day. Local children would often gather to watch the hopping merchant, and some would hop alongside him for short distances in solidarity. The Chronicles of Canterbury Cathedral mention his arrival, noting that by the time he reached the shrine of Thomas Becket, his right foot had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the sock had been worn through completely. Several blisters had become infected, but Thomas refused medical treatment until he had completed his final prayers at the shrine. Perhaps most remarkable about this vow was its impact on others. In the years following Thomas's pilgrimage, several other one-footed pilgrims appeared on the London to Canterbury road, though most abandoned the practice after a few miles. The tradition actually continued sporadically for nearly 50 years, with the last recorded one-footed pilgrim making the journey in 1318. Thomas himself became something of a local celebrity after completing his vow. He established an inn called the Hopping Man near Canterbury, where he would entertain guests with tales of his unusual journey until his death in 1289. Number 5. The Animal Speaking Abbess. Could you speak only in animal sounds for a year? One Italian nun did exactly that. In 1301, Sister Magdalena of Florence, an abbess in a small convent outside Milan, made one of the most peculiar religious vows recorded in medieval church history. After what she described as a divine vision featuring St. Francis of Assisi, known for his connection to animals, Magdalena vowed to speak only in the sounds of animals for 1 full year. This wasn't some private eccentricity practiced in solitude. As the leader of her convent, Magdalena continued her administrative duties while communicating entirely through carefully chosen animal noises. According to convent records, she developed an elaborate system. A dove's coo signified approval. A wolf's howl meant danger or warning. A cat's meow indicated mealtime, and so on. Most fascinating were the detailed accounts of how this affected convent life. Initially, many sisters believed their abbess had succumbed to demonic possession or madness. Several senior nuns attempted to have her removed from leadership. However, after 2 months, the entire convent had adapted to her unusual form of communication. Visitors to the convent reported the surreal experience of seeing nuns responding naturally to their abbess's barks, chirps, and bleats, as if they were ordinary conversation. Magdalena's vow created unexpected consequences. The convent became something of a local attraction, with curious nobles and church officials visiting to witness the animal-speaking abbess. This brought unexpected donations and support to what had previously been a poor and overlooked religious community. Church authorities were divided on the matter. Some local priests condemned the practice as blasphemous, while others saw it as a profound form of devotion to St. Francis's teachings about the natural world. The Bishop of Milan personally visited and, after witnessing Magdalena's continued piety and the convent's newfound prosperity, gave his reluctant blessing to the practice. When Magdalena's vow ended after a year, Convent records indicate she had difficulty speaking normally again, often slipping into animal sounds during moments of stress or deep prayer. The experience transformed the convent's practices permanently. They adopted a series of animal calls as part of their daily prayer rituals, a tradition that reportedly continued until the convent was dissolved during the Napoleonic era nearly 5 centuries later. Number 4. The Standing Man of Straborg. Have you ever stood up for something you believe in? What about standing non-stop for 6 years? In 1356, amid the chaos of the 100 Years' War, a German merchant named Heinrich Müller made a vow that would reshape his entire existence. After his entire family was killed during a French raid on his village near Straborg, Heinrich swore he would not sit or lie down until peace was declared between France and England. This wasn't a metaphorical promise. Heinrich literally remained standing for the next 6 years. He abandoned his trade as a cloth merchant and took up a position at the main square in Straborg, standing perfectly still for hours each day, with a sign explaining his vow in both German and French. At night, Heinrich would continue standing, leaning slightly against walls for support, but never allowing himself to slide down or sit. According to city records, he developed a technique of sleeping while standing, achieving brief moments of rest while maintaining his upright position. The physical consequences were severe. Heinrich's legs swelled dramatically and he developed painful varicose veins that chronicles describe as twisted ropes beneath his skin. His feet became deformed from bearing his weight constantly. Several physicians documented his condition, amazed that he could continue standing despite the obvious agony it caused. What began as one man's extreme grief response transformed into something much larger. Heinrich became a living symbol of the war's toll on ordinary people. Local residents began bringing him food and drink. During harsh winter months, concerned citizens built a small shelter around him, carefully designed so he could remain standing within it. Records indicate that nobles, diplomats, and even military leaders from both sides of the conflict made detours to Straborg to witness the Standing Man. Several accounts mention French knights who were so moved by his silent protest that they temporarily laid down their weapons. Heinrich maintained his vow until 1362, when a temporary peace treaty was signed between England and France. Contemporary accounts describe how, when news of the treaty reached Straborg, crowds gathered to watch Heinrich sit down for the first time in 6 years. The moment was apparently so emotional that hardened soldiers wept openly as Heinrich's legs buckled and he was carefully lowered onto a specially prepared cushioned bench. Perhaps most remarkably, Heinrich's protest inspired at least 12 documented standing vows throughout Europe in the following century, though none maintained their stance for more than a few months. Number 3. The perpetually spinning monk. Ever felt dizzy after spinning around? Imagine spinning as your life's devotion. In 1278, a Benedictine monk named Brother Johannes in a monastery near Cologne, Germany, made a vow that defied both physical limitations and common sense. After experiencing what he described as a vision of the universe's celestial movements, Johannes pledged to spend every waking hour slowly spinning clockwise, believing this rotation connected him directly to divine energies. This wasn't occasional twirling. For nearly 11 years, Johannes rotated continuously whenever he wasn't sleeping. He developed a shuffling gait that allowed him to maintain a slow, constant spin while performing his monastic duties. Monastery records describe how he would spin while copying manuscripts, producing notably curved lines of text, while eating, requiring specially designed circular plates, and even during prayer services, leading to a separate position in the chapel where his movement wouldn't distract others. The physiological effects were profound. Documents from the monastery's infirmary note that Johannes initially suffered severe vertigo and nausea, vomiting frequently during the first months of his vow. Over time, his body adapted remarkably. He developed an extraordinary sense of balance and, according to witness accounts, appeared to enter trance-like states during his rotations. What makes this vow especially interesting was the monastery's reaction. Rather than discouraging this bizarre behavior, the abbot declared it a valid form of devotion after scriptural debates about divine movements and the celestial dance. The monastery eventually adapted to accommodate Johannes's perpetual spinning. Doorways he frequently used were widened. His workstation was moved to prevent him from knocking over valuable manuscripts, and younger monks were assigned to walk alongside him during processions to prevent collisions. Local peasants began attributing miraculous powers to the spinning monk. Mothers brought sick children to watch him rotate, believing the motion had healing properties. Farmers would ask him to spin in their fields, convinced it would improve crop yields. These beliefs persisted despite the monastery's attempts to discourage such superstitions. Johannes maintained his spinning vow until his death in 1289, reportedly continuing his rotation even during his final illness. What's particularly fascinating is the medical assessment from the monastery's infirmarian, who noted Johannes had developed a completely asymmetrical muscular system. The right side of his body was significantly more developed than his left due to the clockwise spinning. After his death, several younger monks attempted to continue the tradition, but none maintained the practice for more than a few weeks, complaining of unbearable dizziness and nausea. The practice became known as Johannes's devotion and was occasionally referenced in German theological texts as an example of extraordinary physical dedication to spiritual practice. Number 2. The backwards walking widow. Have you ever tried walking backwards? Could you do it for 7 years straight? In 1323, Lady Margaret Beaufort, no relation to the famous Tudor matriarch, made a vow following her husband's death that left people throughout medieval England staring in amazement. After Sir William Beaufort died while traveling in France, Lady Margaret pledged never to turn her back on England again, which she interpreted literally to mean she would walk backwards whenever leaving her home until her dying day. This wasn't just for show. Contemporary accounts describe how Margaret developed incredible skill at backward movement. She can navigate the uneven streets of London walking backwards at nearly normal speed, using a small hand-tiled mirror to guide herself. For longer journeys, she would ride her horse facing backwards in the saddle, a position that required specially designed riding equipment. The most fascinating aspects of her vow were the practical adaptations she made. Servants were trained to warn her of obstacles. Her dresses were redesigned with reinforced padding at the back to minimize injury from inevitable collisions. She reportedly developed such acute hearing that she could identify approaching carts and people by sound alone. Lady Margaret maintained this vow for 7 years while continuing her duties, managing her late husband's extensive estates. Court records show she even appeared backwards before King Edward II during a property dispute, causing quite a stir among courtiers. Rather than being offended, chronicles suggest the king was so impressed by her dedication that he ruled in her favor. What began as an object of ridicule evolved into something approaching respect. A contemporary poem refers to Lady Backwards as representing loyalty beyond reason, a virtue highly prized in medieval society. Religious authorities were divided, with some priests condemning the practice as prideful ostentation, while others praised it as an extraordinary demonstration of marital devotion. The physical toll was considerable. Medical accounts suggest Margaret developed unusual muscular development in her calves and lower back from years of backward walking. She suffered numerous injuries from falls, including a broken arm and several concussions. Despite these hardships, she maintained her vow until remarrying in 1330, when her new husband reportedly convinced her that her loyalty to Sir William had been sufficiently demonstrated. Perhaps most interesting is how her unusual behavior influenced others. At least 3 other widows in northern England adopted backward walking as a sign of mourning, though none maintained it for more than a few months. The practice briefly became known as a Beaufort devotion, before disappearing from recorded history by the mid-14th century. Number 1. The chained penitent of Venice. Would you chain yourself to a church for decades? One Venetian man did just that. In 1202, as the Fourth Crusade was gathering in Venice, a wealthy merchant named Antonio Barozzi made perhaps the most extreme personal vow in medieval history. After confessing to significant financial crimes that had ruined several families, Antonio had himself publicly chained to a pillar outside St. Mark's Basilica, swearing he would remain there until he had repaid every coin he had dishonestly earned. This wasn't a temporary display of remorse. Antonio arranged for a heavy iron chain to be fashioned around his waist, with the other end permanently affixed to the church. The chain was purposely made long enough to allow him to lie down in a small shelter built nearby and to access a simple latrine, but short enough to keep him within view of the basilica's entrance at all times. Contemporary Venetian records provide remarkable details about Antonio's decades-long penance. He established a small trading operation that he could conduct from his chained position, carefully documenting every transaction and profit, which he used to make regular payments to those he had wronged. Visitors to Venice often mentioned the unusual sight of the chained man conducting business, writing in ledgers and negotiating with merchants who came to his restricted location. The social dimensions of this vow were complex. Initially, Antonio was subjected to public ridicule and abuse. People would throw waste at him and mock his predicament. However, as years passed and Venetians witnessed his consistent efforts to make amends, attitudes shifted dramatically. His chained existence became a respected fixture of Venetian public life. Church authorities initially opposed the spectacle, but eventually embraced it as a powerful symbol of penance. Documents from the basilica's archives note that priests would regularly bring Antonio communion and hear his confession at his chained station. Several sermons from the period reference our chained brother as an example of true repentance. The physical hardships were extreme. Venice's famous flooding regularly submerged Antonio's small living area. During winter, he suffered frostbite several times. Medical records mention treatments for chain-related injuries, including severe chafing and infections where the iron rubbed against his skin. Despite these challenges, Antonio maintained his position through summer heat and winter cold for an astounding 28 years. What's particularly fascinating is how Antonio's presence shaped Venetian commercial culture. His meticulous record-keeping of debts and repayments became a model that influenced Venetian banking practices. Several major trading families began requiring similar detailed accounting after witnessing Antonio's system. Antonio finally completed his repayments in 1230, having returned every coin with interest to those he had defrauded. In a public ceremony, attended by thousands of Venetians, the Doge himself unlocked Antonio's chain. Contemporary accounts describe how, when offered the chance to leave, Antonio initially couldn't walk more than a few steps after decades of restricted movement. The most remarkable postscript to this story is that Antonio, though finally free, chose to remain near his pillar, living in the same small shelter until his death 4 years later. His chain was hung inside the basilica as a reminder of his extraordinary penance, where it reportedly remained on display until the Napoleonic occupation nearly 6 centuries later. Did these extreme medieval vows represent madness or the ultimate devotions? What would drive you to make such extraordinary promises?